trial against Barkwell began, Columbia had no doubt that what had happened to Scott was murder, and much of the town was already sympathetic towards his plight, as evidence for his innocence slowly emerged. The core of the defense and those involved with it were still vehemently supportive of the mob's actions. Also for the defense is Roy McDonald, a clerk for the MKT Railroad. Crime once again strikes in relation to the railroad, as the clerk supports the act of lynching. The most important witness was Charles Nutter, class of 29, the student who Scott addressed on the bridge begging for his life. His testimony was the most important, as he had a first-hand eyewitness account of the proceedings on the bridge, and he definitively identified Barkwell as the man who put the noose around Scott's neck and pushed. The defense heavily attacked Nutter, but he stood up to his testimony. After the trial, rumors flew that a mob was coming after Nutter to beat him up. He bought a ticket to St. Louis on the railroad, planning to return in 2 weeks when things cooled down. Fellow journalist students walked him to the station, stopping at a restaurant on the way. People in the restaurant started shouting and threatening him. Nutter immediately got on a train. Watson was not the only person deeply affected by the lynching. George Vaughn's career took off in 1948 when newspapers and Life magazine ran a photo of him demanding that Mississippi delegation be unseated for supporting white supremacy. He won a landmark Supreme Court case allowing blacks to buy property in white-only neighborhoods. This legislation allowed the play A Raisin in the Sun by Lorraine Hansberry to be written where black families' tumultuous lives could be set straight by moving into a house in a white neighborhood. Vaughn's brief in Shelley v. Kramer is assigned reading at Harvard Law. Charles Nutter became a star journalist. He wrote a letter to Joseph Stalin asking for a confirmation that he was not dead. Stalin wrote him back saying he was alive and not to be disturbed. Nutter received the highest journalism award from MU, the Missouri Honor Medal, in 1944. He also found himself embroiled in conspiracy theories following the Kennedy assassination. Clay Shaw was a businessman and personal acquaintance to Nutter. He was accused of being one of the principal men responsible for the assassination. Nutter knew this was untrue and that Shaw was only being attacked for his homosexuality. He defended Shaw loudly and often, standing up for the truth. Unlike his experience with Scott, Nutter won. Herman Olmsted, although forbidding the family to ever speak of the incident again, encountered racism for the rest of his life. In 1937, he traveled around the world with his wife, Elizabeth. When they were in Germany, they stopped at a political rally where Hitler was speaking. Elizabeth was English, aware of what he stood for, and hated him for it. Hitler went through the crowd just passing by Elizabeth. When they returned to the United States, Olmsted was a victim of verbal abuse for his German heritage. Olmsted retired before the end of the war. In 1954, he fell and broke his hip, dying a few weeks later. Regina Olmsted, like her sisters, graduated from MU. She received her arts and science degree in 1932. She went to nursing school in St. Louis, where she met her future husband. After traveling to Europe and working in New York, she came back to Missouri and married him. She died in 1980 without ever uttering a word to her sons about what happened to her when she was young. Gertrude Carter Scott never recovered from the tragedy of her husband. After Scott's funeral, she moved back in with her parents, remaining in Columbia for the rest of her life. She quit teaching at Douglas School. She sank slowly into a depression and began missing church regularly, eventually disappearing from sight altogether. The story of James Scott, who he was, died with her. The height of George Barkwell's life ended after his acquittal. His daughter died of a long illness in 1925. His nephew, whom he considered an adopted son, disappeared from his life. His stature around town diminished soon after the trial. Not only did everyone in Columbia assume he committed the murder, he even bragged that he had done it. Columbia quickly became disgusted with Barkwell. He died in 1948 after a long illness. While he received an obituary in the Missourian that regarded him as a prominent resident, there was no family left to carry his coffin. He died alone. James Scott's funeral, in contrast, was full of people. While family grieved at Parker Funeral Home, hundreds of men and women came in to view his body. He was buried in Columbia Cemetery in the back in what was deemed the black section. This section is sparse and lonely, with none of the monumental headstones seen near the front of the cemetery. A simple concrete block marks where he is buried, embossed with his name and years of life and death. A crude arrow points to the ground where his body lies. John Stewart, builder of the bridge where Scott was lynched, is buried near the front of the cemetery in a family plot. Barkwell, for all his hatred of blacks and his hand in Scott's murder, is buried only a lane over from him. Their graves are not far off from the MKT trail and what used to be Stewart Bridge, where the most monumental moments of their lives happened. The cemetery itself is like the trail, since people jog and walk their dogs among the headstones of the large and historic graveyard, some in order to feel closer to loved ones buried there. Despite what I imagine each man's disgust would be over this idea, the two are joined in a multitude of ways. The biggest difference between them remains not what color their skin was, but how much they are loved after death. Visitors to Barkwell's grave today would only occur to those curious about his role in Scott's lynching. Awareness about the plight of James Scott has been raised over the years. Local filmmaker Scott Wilson became interested in Scott's story for a documentary. After seeing his death certificate, Wilson began a crusade to change it. Around the same time, Reverend Clyde Ruffin of Scott's Old Church, Second Missionary Baptist, was researching the church's history when he came across Reverend Caston. After learning about Scott's story, he visited his grave and was saddened by the simple concrete slab. He began a mission fundraising money to get a new headstone for Scott. A benefit for Scott, which included a memorial service, was held in November of 2010.
That the fleeting moment of your time on this earth was not in vain. Your life and death were not in vain, because you have brought all of us together this day as one. Because of you, James Thomas Scott, we stand shoulder to shoulder against all barriers that would separate us.
I want Jesus to walk with me. I want Jesus to walk with me.
It has been 88 years, but today is the day that we are blessed to say there is rest when our songs are glad with the joys of life. There is rest when our hearts are sad with its ills and strife. There is rest in the gifts of love for the searching soul. There is rest though the winds and waves may roll. There is rest when sin would our soul ensnare. There is rest in the arms of God so fair. James Thomas Scott, take your rest sweet rest. God bless you.
Amen.